2002 is a year of many changes in the world of cinema. Scooby-Doo hits the big screen, and the series Jackass also makes its debut in theaters with its first movie. In soccer, Brazil would win the World Cup held in Korea, Japan, and in WWE, new names, brand divisions, and much more would come. A big shout out to Mauricio Sandon. Remember to comment and you could appear in upcoming videos. Video 1,000 likes. The goal of likes is essential to continue with the series. The previous year, the whole Invasion storyline had already ended and World Wrestling Federation had come out with the final victory. Ric Flair was the new co-owner of the company, along with Vince McMahon and Chris Jericho. He became the first undisputed world champion by defeating The Rock and Steve Austin in one night. That said, his celebrations would be brief, as at the Royal Rumble on January 20, he had to defend the title against The Rock once more. On top of that, Triple H had just returned to the company after almost a year out due to injury, now being pushed as a massive babyface on the same level as Stone Cold himself. Steve Austin. It was a big deal that both entered the Royal Rumble that night, as they both aimed for a main event spot at WrestleMania. However, before getting there, the preliminary card would see Spike, Dudley, and Taz defend their recently won World Tag Team titles against the Dudley Boys. William Regal would win the Intercontinental title from Edge, and Vince McMahon and Ric Flair would go into a street fight. Then Chris Jericho would challenge the rules after getting a dirty win over The Rock at the Royal Rumble. We would see memorable moments, like Maven eliminating The Undertaker, the return of Mr. Perfect, and Triple H, who would ultimately come out victorious. After finally eliminating Kurt Angle, the game was now in the main event of WrestleMania. But that wouldn't stop Stone Cold from getting one more shot at the gold, since after defeating Kurt Angle on the January 28th episode of Raw, he would become the #1 contender, and his match against Chris Jericho would be set for No Way Out on February 17th. But that wasn't even the big story going into this event, because feeling that he needed to get rid of Ric Flair from the World Wrestling Federation, once and for all, Vince McMahon would decide to bring some old friends who had made a name for themselves in another company into his organization. The New World Order was coming to WWE, and this decision was met with a lot of attention behind the scenes. And that was because former World Championship Wrestling wrestlers had already shaken up WWE, because these guys were pretty tough. Even so, it was Vince who had the final say, and he believed he could control the faction. And that's why he would feel confident reintroducing them to the audience at No Way Out, giving them an interview segment at the start of the show and then a backstage segment. With The Rock, as far as The Rock was concerned, he had more important things to worry about, because that night he would have a match with The Undertaker on the card. We also had Regal defeating Edge once again, and Rob Van Dam picking up a win over Goldust. After that, the first of the two main events would feature Triple H going one-on-one with Kurt Angle, with the game at a disadvantage after Stephanie McMahon appointed herself as the special referee. Guest referee. Of course, the reason this was a disadvantage was because, after lying about being pregnant to her husband, Triple H had thrown her out of the house, sparking a rivalry between the two. Triple H struggled and lost to Angle in a nearly 15-minute match. And in the final match, Chris Jericho would defend his undisputed world title against Steve Austin, but even though Austin seemed to have won it at some moments, an interference from the New World Order would ultimately put a stop to this, allowing Chris Jericho to leave as champion. Would Stone Cold get into a rivalry with Scott Hall? And that's how the build-up for WrestleMania 18 would begin, where not only would the Rattlesnake face Scott Hall, but Hulk Hogan would also challenge The Rock. To see who was really the biggest mainstream star in the entire history of wrestling? Yes, it was a dream match, one that fans thought they would never see, but that wasn't all that was happening during this event. Rob Van Dam would win the Intercontinental title from William Regal Diamond. Dallas Page would finally get his WrestleMania match against Christian, and Billy and Chuck would defend the World Wrestling Federation tag team titles in a 4-corner elimination match. On top of that, Edge and Booker T would fight for the right to appear in a shampoo commercial. Jazz would defeat Trish Stratus and Lita to leave the event as women's champion, and The Undertaker would take his streak to 10-0 after beating Ric Flair. Then, after this, Steve Austin would get a convincing win over Scott Hall, and The Rock and Hulk Hogan would steal the show in an absolutely electric match, which probably still ranks as the biggest sustained crowd reaction of all time. Of course, that wouldn't be the last match of the night. That would come when Chris Jericho, now with Stephanie McMahon in his corner, would face Triple H for the undisputed world title. This match was ultimately overshadowed by the crowd's exhaustion, especially after The Rock versus Hulk Hogan. The fans would finally see the game come out victorious from this match, thus beginning his reign at the top. But there was little time to celebrate this, as in the following weeks, major changes were on the horizon for the World Wrestling Federation. Yes, as Brock Lesnar, accompanied by Paul Heyman, made his impactful debut. Steve Austin was actually absent from the next 2 television episodes due to frustration over his relatively small role at WrestleMania. Vince McMahon and Ric Flair would shake things up even more when they announced the brand split, making Raw and SmackDown now have exclusive rosters. So with Flair taking control of the red brand and McMahon in charge of the blue brand, the first draft would see the roster practically split in half. Since superstars like Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and the remaining members of the New World Order became exclusive to Raw, while The Rock, Hulk Hogan, and Kurt Angle became exclusive to SmackDown. I say the remaining members of the New World Order because after losing to The Rock at WrestleMania, the Hulkster would go back to wearing red and yellow. And this would quickly catapult him to the #1 contender spot, since at Backlash on April 21, he would face Triple H for the undisputed world title. That's right, after almost a decade of being out of World Wrestling Federation title matches, Hogan was back, but before getting there, the rest of the card would see Raw and SmackDown alternate matches. Eddie Guerrero won the Intercontinental title from Rob Van Dam, The Undertaker beat Steve Austin, and Brock Lesnar made an impact by destroying Jeff Hardy. Then in the main event, a real surprise would come as Hulk Hogan would defeat Triple H to start another run at the top. Something that was more than welcomed by all the fans, of course, but what they didn't take well was the fact that after that, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, is also called World Wrestling Federation, filed a lawsuit against Vince McMahon's company for the continued illegal use of its name in Europe. Vince McMahon would be forced to change the company's name on May 6th, and the boss would decide to drop the F and change the brand's name to WWE. This meant that the company's venture into the United Kingdom on May 4 for the Insurrection event would be the last time they used the name World Wrestling Federation. By Judgment Day on May 19, it would be a whole new world, and that new world would see Brock Lesnar continue to dominate as he now defeated both Hardy Boys at the same time. Edge forced Krankle to shave his head after defeating him in a hair versus hair match, and the fall of Steve Austin in non-main event matches. It would continue as he faced Big Show and Ric Flair in a handicap match. Then, inside Hell in a Cell, Triple H and Chris Jericho would go into a match once again, with the game winning for the second time, after delivering a pedigree on the cage roof. But that wasn't the main event of the night. That match would come when The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan fought for the undisputed world title. Although Hogan gave it his all, Hulkamania couldn't overcome The Undertaker, who ultimately became the new champion. Yes, as much as things had been forced to change at the corporate level, it seems the company would continue moving forward creatively without any problems. That was until Steve Austin decided to skip the June 10 episode of Raw in protest over being asked to lose cleanly against Brock Lesnar in an unannounced King of the Ring qualifier. Now it's not like the Rattlesnake had any problem putting Brock Lesnar over. He believed a star like Lesnar deserved more than just winning a throwaway match on a random episode of Raw. And that's why, with his frustrations already building up for months, at this point he chose to leave the company for good, making Vince McMahon issue a statement on next week's Red Brand episode to address the situation. Yes, Austin was gone, and at that moment, it felt like he was gone for good. At the next event, King of the Ring, on June 23rd, Brock Lesnar defeated both Test and Rob Van Dam that night to take the crown and become the #1 contender for the undisputed world title. But this wasn't the only noteworthy thing happening at that show, because in other matches, Jimmy Noble would become the new Cruiserweight champion after defeating the Hurricane. Molly Holly would make history by winning the women's title, and Kurt Angle would further elevate his prestige by earning a rare submission victory over Hulk Hogan. Then, in the main event, with The Rock sitting at the commentary table, Triple H would challenge The Undertaker for the undisputed world title, where the Deadman would retain his championship. Of course, a career that was coming to an end at that time was that of the New World Order. After Hulk Hogan left the group, everything had faded away, even with new members such as X-Pac, Booker T, and The Big Show. On the July 15 Raw episode, Vince McMahon announced that Ric Flair would leave his managerial role and return as a full-time wrestler, formally dissolving the New World Order as well. Then Vince McMahon would announce that from now on, Raw and SmackDown would have general managers. And as for the Red brand, that manager would be none other than the former World Championship Wrestling boss, Eric Bischoff. Yes, the image of McMahon and Bischoff hugging at the top of the entrance was a sign for many that money always wins. Stephanie McMahon would manage SmackDown. The era of ruthless aggression began just in time for the Vengeance event on July 21, only a month after John Cena made his debut on SmackDown, challenging Kurt Angle, where he would now get a big victory by defeating Greg Jericho in a singles match. After that, while Shawn Michaels was trying to help his old friend Triple H decide which brand to sign with full time, after losing the Undisputed World title a couple of months earlier, Undertaker, Kurt Angle, and The Rock would have one of the best triple threat matches in WWE history for the top prize. And at the end of this, it would be the People's Champion who would be left standing, setting the stage for The Rock versus Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam. Just a month later, after a tour in Australia, Eric Bischoff set out to unify all the singles titles on Raw. And this would mean that after defeating then Hardcore Champion Tommy Dreamer and European Champion Jeff Hardy in separate matches, Rob Van Dam would merge them with the Intercontinental title. This would lead to the first two belts being retired. 4 years earlier, Shawn Michaels had to retire due to a back injury. However, Michaels would announce that he was returning to the ring once again, this time to face Triple H, after the game turned heel and betrayed him. And after much anticipation, his comeback match would finally happen at SummerSlam on August 25, where he would prove that he hadn't lost a step, just a beat. The Heartbreak Kid would go into a match with his friend, now turned enemy, in a brutal and brilliant street fight, ultimately coming out victorious in the end. Besides this match, the card also featured people like Corey Angle and Rey Mysterio, opening the show with a pretty fast-paced classic match. Ric Flair would make Chris Jericho submit, and The Undertaker would beat Test. Then, in the main event, The Rock would defend the Undisputed World title against Brock Lesnar, so when it was time to face the People's Champion, Brock was ready. In a 16-minute match, he would prove to be so impressive that he actually made The Rock turn heel with the live crowd. And once he got tired of playing with his prey, Brock Lesnar would deliver a brutal F5 to the champion and make the pin to become the new WWE champion and the youngest in history at that time. As for The Rock, would he formally turn heel with the live crowd after the match, all before announcing that he was leaving again to film another movie? In the following weeks, Eric Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon would plot to sign the new champion exclusively, leaving the other brand without a world champion. That's how, in the end, Stephanie McMahon was the one who succeeded by beating Eric Bischoff, a decision that forced Eric to revive the match. Big gold was awarded to Triple H on the September 2 episode of Raw, naming him the new World Heavyweight Champion. It goes without saying that this earned Triple H a lot of hate from the audience, and from that moment his reign of terror would begin, a period that would last for the next year and a half. dominating the red brand and defeating every opponent who challenged him to become champion. And the first opponent to feel this wrath would be Rob Van Dam, since at Unforgiven on September 22, he would face and defeat the former Extreme Championship Wrestling star. At that event, Trish Stratus regained the women's title from Molly Holly, and Kurt Angle had another classic match with Chris Benoit. Of course, after this match, both wrestlers would earn so much mutual respect that they would decide to team up. When SmackDown announced a tournament to crown the first tag team champions of the blue brand. This was done after the 3 world tag team titles became exclusive to the red brand, and the finals of this tournament would take place at No Mercy on October 20, where in one of the best tag team matches in history, Angle and Benoit would face Edge and Rey Mysterio, defeating them after just over 22 minutes to become the inaugural champions. Notably, Rey Mysterio joined WWE only 3 months earlier. After a final tour of the United Kingdom for Rebellion on October 26, they returned to the United States, just in time for Survivor Series, which would be held on November 17 inside Madison Square Garden. But what made this event so special? Well, after his triumphant return at SummerSlam earlier that year, Shawn Michaels would step back into the ring to take part in the first ever Elimination Chamber match in history. And in that first edition, the Raw World Heavyweight Championship was on the line as Triple H would defend it against Shawn Michaels, Rob Van Dam, Chris Jericho, Kane, and Booker T. However, before we got to that match, the rest of the card would see multiple titles change hands. When Billy Kidman defeated Jimmy Noble and won the Cruiserweight title, Victoria beat Trish Stratus to take home the Women's Championship, and Los Guerreros won the WWE Tag Team titles during a triple threat match. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that Brock Lesnar suffered his first loss by countout on the main roster when Paul Heyman turned his back on him and sided with his opponent. That night, Big Show, yes, just like he had done at the same event 3 years earlier, Big Show won the WWE Championship. But even then, that wouldn't be the last title change of the night. Because in the final Elimination Chamber match, the Heartbreak Kid would survive 5 other men, and he would temporarily end the Reign of Terror. When would he win the World Heavyweight Championship for the only time in his career? Now we move to the year's final event, Armageddon, on December 15th. Because there, after a great card that saw Booker T and Goldust win the World Tag Team titles, Chris Benoit would defeat Eddie Guerrero in an excellent singles match, and Evolution would begin to take shape. Batista, accompanied by Ric Flair, defeated Kane. Then it would be Angle who would face Big Show one-on-one, a match that ended the Giants' 1-month reign. After that, Triple H and Shawn Michaels would go on to a 3 stages of hell match, with The Game winning the first fall, a street fight, and Shawn Michaels taking the second, a Hell in a Cell match. The final fall would be a ladder match. Both were completely exhausted and gave their all, but in the end, Triple H emerged victorious. Since with his reign of terror far from ending, he would close the year as world champion, heavyweight once again. That's how 2002 ended. 2003 would bring a lot, but that's a story for another video.